The cold night breeze blew fiercely, hitting Miles Jameson with icy gusts that made him shiver down to his bones. As he stepped out of the car, he zipped his jacket up to his neck, hoping the thin fabric could shield him from the harsh weather, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. His car, a gray sedan that had been his faithful travel companion, was stranded in the middle of the deserted road, its headlights casting a dim light on a gloomy stretch of the path. The moon barely peeked through the thick clouds, and the only sound was the persistent whisper of the wind sweeping across the lonely fields. As he looked at the stalled car, with its engine that had given its final effort, Miles felt as if, somehow, the vehicle had surrendered alongside him, as if they shared the same existential fatigue. Raising his gaze, a beam of light caught his attention in the distance. The lights of a solitary farmhouse glowed far away, defying the darkness. It was an old, two-story house, with illuminated windows that seemed to gaze at him from afar. The farmhouse stood in the middle of nowhere, like an oasis in the desert of the night, and Miles had no choice but to head toward it, though a slight unease began to grow in his chest. Miles pulled his jacket tighter around himself and took a step forward, feeling the damp ground beneath his feet. With each step, his shoes sank into the mud, a constant reminder that the road was longer and more challenging than he had anticipated. The moisture seeped through his pants, and a shiver ran down his spine, mixed with the strange sensation that someone or something was watching him from the shadows around him. The dark, overcast sky stretched like an oppressive blanket over him, amplifying the loneliness and mystery of the place. As he walked, Miles's thoughts wandered to the purpose that had brought him there. He had left everything behind in search of answers, but now, alone in the immensity of the night, he felt the weariness of the years, even of the successes he had achieved, piling up inside him, filling every corner of his being with emptiness. He tried to shake off those thoughts, reminding himself that the only important thing was to reach the farmhouse and ask for help. There was no room for nostalgia, not at that moment, not when the night seemed to close in on him like a trap. Finally, he arrived at the farmhouse door. He paused, hesitating, his hand halfway up to knock on the worn wood. A strange chill ran over his skin, as if something in the atmosphere warned him of an invisible danger, something beyond the mere discomfort of being a stranger asking for help in the middle of the night. With his heart pounding, he gently knocked on the door and waited, straining to hear any sound. The echo of his own knocks reverberated in the darkness, and an almost ghostly silence enveloped the surroundings. Nothing. He waited a few seconds, his mind filled with thoughts about what might be behind that door. A sleeping family, a lone person, or perhaps something he couldn't fully understand. He knocked again, this time with more force, and after a few moments, he heard footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman with a hard yet somehow welcoming gaze. She leaned against the door, holding it firmly as if she wasn't used to receiving unexpected visitors. Her figure, wrapped in a simple robe, had the tense posture of someone who constantly faced the world alone. Despite the cold welcome in her eyes, there was something in her that suggested a deep strength and determination, qualities that only those who have endured tough trials tend to acquire. Miles noticed that the woman seemed unwilling to open the door completely. Instead, she remained there, partially blocking the entrance and watching him warily. "Who are you?" she asked bluntly, her voice firm and clear, laden with a distrust evident only in those accustomed to solitude. Miles removed his hat in an automatic gesture of respect, hoping it might soften her impression, though she showed no reaction. "My car broke down a few kilometers from here," he explained, gesturing toward the path he had taken. "I have no signal, and I don't have a place to spend the night. I thought maybe you could help me." The woman frowned, clearly suspicious, her eyes scrutinizing him intently, assessing each word and gesture. Living alone on such an isolated farm did not allow her to trust strangers easily. However, something in Miles's weary posture, the hidden sadness behind his eyes, seemed to make her hesitate for a moment. She observed his soaked clothes, the mud stains on his shoes, and most of all, the expression of exhaustion and vulnerability reflected on his face. "Are you alone?" she asked, still cautious, her gaze continuing to analyze him intensely. Miles nodded, showing the palms of his hands as a sign of honesty. Yes, just me. I don't want to disturb you, I just need a place until dawn. The silence between them stretched, becoming dense, almost palpable. The woman kept her steady gaze on him, as if searching for something that would convince her he wasn't a threat. Finally, she let out a soft sigh, expressing both distrust and resignation. There's a room outside the house, in the barn, she finally said, her voice firm but slightly softer. It's simple but safe. You can stay there for the night. Miles felt a relief he tried to disguise, forcing a faint smile to avoid seeming too desperate. Thank you, he replied. Really, thank you very much. The woman opened the door a little more, though still not fully letting him inside. Come in for a moment, it's cold outside, she said in a neutral tone, gesturing toward the house's interior. I'll prepare the room, but you can have some coffee while you wait. Without hesitation, Miles accepted the invitation and stepped inside. As he crossed the threshold, the warmth of the house enveloped him immediately, in stark contrast to the night's cold. The interior was modest but cozy, decorated with the simplicity of someone who leads a life of hard work. There were old but well-maintained furniture pieces that gave the place a rustic warmth. In the living room, a worn leather sofa and a small bookshelf with a few books filled the space. The lighting was dim, provided by a table lamp in the corner, casting soft shadows on the wooden walls. It was then that something in the atmosphere caught his attention. There, in a corner of the room, illuminated by the lamp's gentle glow, stood a sculpture. It was a marble piece, polished and delicately carved, seeming to radiate a life of its own in the dim light. Miles felt his heart skip a beat upon recognizing that artwork. Every line and curve was familiar, as if it belonged to a chapter of his past he had tried to forget. That sculpture was the work of Mariana, the woman he had loved more than 20 years ago. The weight of her words fell on Miles like a heavy stone. Mariana, the woman he had loved and lost, was the mother of the woman standing in front of him. Time seemed to freeze as memories flooded his mind. He clearly remembered how Mariana used to sculpt in that small studio in Paris, where the afternoon sun would light up her face as she shaped each piece with dedication and love. And now, without warning, the past had slipped back into his life in a way he could never have imagined. Trying not to show the turmoil consuming him, Miles looked at the woman once more. He wanted to ask her more, but he feared any additional words might shatter the delicate balance of their conversation. You resemble her, he finally said, his voice trembling. Mariana, your mother, was a very special person. The woman looked at him with distrust, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. She finally placed her cup on the table and crossed her arms. My mother never mentioned anyone named Miles, she said coldly. She wasn't the type to leave someone behind, especially if they meant something to her. The harshness of her words cut through Miles like a knife. It was clear that there was a story she didn't know, a story he himself had tried to bury because of the pain it caused him. However, he knew he couldn't reveal everything just yet, not without understanding more about who this woman truly was and what she thought about the past. The silence between them thickened, becoming almost suffocating. They looked at each other in silence, as if each was trying to understand the true reason that had brought the other here. I didn't know she had a daughter, Miles finally said, his voice low, barely audible, but loaded with emotion. She seemed surprised, but her expression soon hardened again. She frowned, clearly irritated but also confused. It was evident that the pieces of the story didn't fit in her mind, that she was trying to understand what role he had played in her mother's past. My mother moved here when I was very young, she said, turning her gaze to the window as if the dark landscape might somehow offer answers. She always told me my father was someone who couldn't stay, but she never told me who he was. I thought she'd forgotten about him. Miles closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. He knew his life had never been easy, and now he could understand how deep Mariana's scars had been, the ones she had never let him see. She had moved and raised her daughter alone, without saying a word, without letting the past catch up with her. Trying to find the right words, Miles leaned forward, looking at her sincerely. "If I had known your mother was pregnant, I would never have left her. I swear." "I had no idea," he murmured, feeling the remorse growing within him. She looked at him in silence, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of anger and pain. She had grown up alone, believing her father was an absent figure, someone who had chosen not to be there. And now, this man was sitting before her, telling her that, had he known the truth, he would have acted differently. Finally, she stood up, with an expression that made it clear the conversation was over. "I can show you the room in the barn," she said coldly. "In the morning, you'll be able to find someone who can help you with your car. I think it's best for you to leave as soon as possible." Without waiting for a response, she took a flashlight and walked out of the house, gesturing for him to follow. The cold night air wrapped around them immediately, and the farmhouse felt even more isolated in the darkness. Miles followed her in silence, feeling the weight of her words and the sadness radiating from her silhouette, his daughter. As they walked toward the barn, the sound of the wind and the faint whispers of the animals blended into a symphony of desolation. The flashlight swung in her hand, casting elongated shadows on the ground, and he couldn't help but think how lonely her life must have been, there, without him and without an explanation for the past that had always been absent. When they reached the barn, she opened the door and switched on a small lamp, illuminating the inside with a soft glow. The room was modest, with a bed, a chair, and a small table holding a pitcher of water. Although simple, the space had an unusual tranquility, a kind of melancholic peace that could be felt in the air. "It's not much, but it's safe," she said, without looking at him, her voice hard. "You can sleep here tonight." Miles nodded, trying to find some words to ease the tension, but none seemed sufficient. She handed him the key to the door, avoiding looking into his eyes, and then walked away, disappearing into the darkness without saying another word. He remained there, in the dim light, listening to the sound of the wind battering the farmhouse, accompanied by the soft creak of the wood. He sat on the bed, feeling the weight of the revelations that had just come to light. He remembered Mariana's face as she sculpted in her studio in Paris, and he felt a wave of emotions overwhelm him. Now, the woman he had left behind had a daughter who looked at him as if he were a stranger, as if he were nothing more than a shadow of a past she did not know. As he lay on the bed, aware that sleep would be slow to come, Miles realized he couldn't leave the following morning. He couldn't abandon his daughter without first attempting to make peace with the past and, in some way, with the present he had just discovered. Miles stayed awake, lying on the simple bed in the barn, his eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling that creaked from time to time, as if each plank whispered ancient secrets he couldn't quite grasp. Through the gaps in the walls, the icy wind seeped in, slicing through the air with gusts that made his body tense every so often. The physical exhaustion was there, but the turmoil of his thoughts kept him from resting. He could still see Ava's face, her dark eyes filled with resentment and pain. It was as if his presence, so unexpected, had brought with it all the questions she had kept hidden for years, all the wounds that, perhaps, she no longer remembered. In his memory, Mariana's image continued to linger in his mind, that young artist with loose hair, her hands covered in marble dust as she shaped her work in a small studio in Paris. Miles realized he had never forgotten the warmth of her eyes, the sweetness of her voice, and the way she moved with an almost ethereal grace. How could I have left her? He thought, as a wave of regret washed over him. He got up from the bed and approached the small window of the barn. From there, he could see Ava's house in the distance, with a single light on, casting a soft glow in the darkness. He imagined that she, too, was awake, trapped in her own thoughts, as overwhelmed as he was by the unexpected turn of events. The full moon illuminated the fields with a silver glow, and Miles remembered that Mariana loved that nighttime light, the way it made everything seem part of a dream. They often stayed late in her studio, working in silence, communicating only through knowing glances. Those days felt like a different world, a life that now seemed distant, almost unreal. He wondered what Mariana's life had been like on this farm, raising her daughter alone, without him. How many nights had she spent, too, gazing at the moon, with a similar sense of emptiness? Taking a deep breath, he tried to contain his emotions, but each thought led him to a new question, a new piece of a puzzle he had never known existed. He couldn't help feeling like a stranger in his own story, a character who had been forgotten in a corner, only to be forced to return, though he no longer found his place. Looking at the light in Ava's window, Miles realized he had to do something. He couldn't let this night be just a fleeting step in both of their paths. He knew that if he wanted to find any kind of redemption, he had to face his past and connect with Ava in a way she could understand and accept. The clock struck 3 in the morning, and exhaustion finally began to weigh on him. However, as he lay down again, a decision took shape in his mind. At dawn, he would speak to Ava. He couldn't let his presence on the farm be just another passing night in her life. Although he didn't know how, he had to find a way to build something real with her. He thought of all the words he could say, the explanations he would need to offer, and how to convey how much he regretted not being there for her and for Mariana. He closed his eyes as the sound of the wind became a soft murmur that lulled him. His sleep was restless, fragmented by flashes of memories and faces from a past he thought he had buried. In his dreams, Mariana appeared again and again, looking at him with a mixture of love and disappointment, as if she were trying to tell him something, but the words never managed to form. In the distance, Ava also appeared, watching him with the same hard expression he had seen that night, her eyes filled with questions he didn't know if he could answer. Finally, dawn began to break through the darkness. A golden ray of light filtered through the barn window, illuminating Miles's weary face, and with it, a new day began, full of promises and decisions he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The dawn broke through the calm of the countryside, painting the sky with warm tones as the first light of day spread over the farm. Miles rose from the simple bed, still feeling the weight of the previous night on his shoulders, and stepped out of the barn, inhaling the crisp morning air. In the distance, he spotted Ava in the yard, busy with her morning chores, feeding the horses with swift, precise movements. He watched her in silence for a moment, noticing the firmness in her posture and the efficiency in each of her actions, as if she were determined to do everything on her own, without needing anyone else. Finally, he summoned the courage and walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the dew-covered ground. As he approached, he noticed the shadows of exhaustion on Ava's face, and for a brief instant, a flicker of tenderness crossed her eyes. But as soon as she noticed his presence, she straightened up, fixing him with a cold, defiant stare. "Have you decided to leave yet?" she asked bluntly, not bothering to look at him directly as she continued brushing one of the horses. Her tone was filled with palpable frostiness, as though the icy morning air had seeped into every word. Miles stopped a few steps away from her, lowering his head briefly as if carefully choosing his words before responding. "Ava, I need to talk to you," he began, his voice low but steady, attempting to remain calm despite her hostile gaze. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, especially after so many years. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right, even if it's too late." She set the brush on the ground and crossed her arms, her expression showing a mixture of distrust and defiance. Ava's stance was almost impenetrable, and he could see the emotional distance she was determined to maintain, a barrier he wasn't sure how to break. "And what exactly does making things right mean?" she replied with a sharp tone, making it clear that it wouldn't be easy for her to trust his intentions. "After all these years, do you think a few words will be enough to fix everything?" Miles felt the weight of her words, each one piercing like a dagger. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but confronting reality, the magnitude of his past choices, was more painful than he had anticipated. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he admitted, lowering his voice. "I wouldn't ask for that. But I want you to know that if I had known you existed, I never would have left your mother. I never would have left you both alone." Ava looked at him, and for a moment, Miles could see the internal struggle reflected in her eyes. His words seemed to strike a nerve within her, but he also sensed the resentment she had harbored over the years, a feeling she had nurtured and held on to in the absence of answers. "That's easy to say now," she replied with a cold edge, trying to hide the pain beneath her words. "But the truth is, you weren't here. You weren't here when my mother raised me alone, when she tried to keep this farm running against all odds. You were somewhere else, living your life, far from here. And now you show up, as if that's enough." Each of her words deepened the guilt within Miles. His hands trembled slightly, and he tried to clench his fists to control the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I know I can't change the past, Ava," he said, his voice trembling. "But I want to try to do something now. I've seen the farm, the work it requires, and I realize you can't do it all alone. Let me help you, at least with that." Ava looked at him with disbelief, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her lips twisted into a bitter smirk as she shook her head. "I don't need your help," she replied firmly, stepping back. "This is my life, and I've learned to live without you. I don't need you coming here to fix what I've already achieved on my own." Miles noticed her hands tremble slightly, despite her voice and posture trying to remain strong. Determined, he took a step forward, though careful not to invade her personal space. "I don't want to take anything away from you, Ava," he said softly. "I only want to help you preserve what your mother built, what you have worked so hard to maintain. You don't have to trust me right now, but at least let me support you in this." Ava kept her gaze fixed on him, and for a moment she seemed to wrestle with herself, as if something in his words made her waver. Finally, she turned to the horse, absent-mindedly stroking its mane, and spoke in a low tone, almost as if to herself. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered, but he caught the words, sensing the vulnerability hidden behind that admission. Miles felt the urge to get closer, to take her hand and promise her he wouldn't let her down, that he would do everything possible to be worthy of her trust. But he knew any rash gesture could shatter the fragile truce between them. "All I'm asking for is a chance," he said in an almost pleading tone. "Just one, Ava. If I can't earn your trust, if I can't show you I'm here to stay, I'll leave without insisting." She remained silent for several seconds, her fingers gently stroking the horse's coat in slow, almost hypnotic movements. Finally, without looking at him, she murmured, "I can't promise you anything." Miles nodded, accepting her words without asking for more, knowing that any promise would be a mere illusion at that moment. For now, he had only that small concession, a glimmer of hope that illuminated his desire to repair whatever could still be salvaged. Ava turned her gaze toward the horizon, her eyes drifting off into the landscape as the sun slowly rose, bathing the fields in a soft, golden light. She seemed lost in deep thoughts, and although Miles longed to ask her what was on her mind, he chose to respect her silence. After a long moment, Ava took a deep breath and spoke in a low tone, almost imperceptible. "All right, you can stay. But don't expect anything from me." Miles felt a mixture of relief and sadness upon hearing those words. He knew the path to redemption would be long and arduous, but he now had a starting point, a small hope of reconciliation. He watched Ava in silence as she continued with her tasks, and he understood that, even though she allowed him to stay, he would have to prove to her, day by day, that he was willing to earn her trust. As the hours passed, the farm's routine gradually enveloped Miles in a rhythm that, although unfamiliar, provided him with a strange sense of calm. He had decided to stay, and though Ava remained distant and avoided any unnecessary conversation, she allowed him to help with some of the more strenuous chores. It was as if they were immersed in a silent pact of work, each focused on their tasks but always aware of the other's presence. As the afternoon came, the sun began to sink on the horizon, bathing the farm in a soft golden glow. Miles, who had spent most of the day helping repair a broken fence, paused to take in the landscape. The distant hills seemed to wrap around the farm in a protective embrace, and the sky painted in warm colors reminded him of the sunsets he used to watch in Europe, those he had often shared with Mariana in moments of peace. Determined to continue the pending conversation with Ava, he walked toward the house. He found her in the stable, giving water to one of the horses. She was absorbed, gently patting the animal's back with a tenderness that contrasted with her rigid demeanor and serious expression. Miles approached slowly, knowing any sudden move might cause her to retreat back into her emotional shell. "I need to ask you something," Miles began in a low, almost whispering tone, respecting the quiet atmosphere. "I can't stop thinking about your mother, about what she told you about me. Or what she perhaps never mentioned." She didn't respond immediately, and he noticed a slight tension in her shoulders. However, after a few seconds, she slowly turned around, her eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and caution. "My mother," Ava began, her voice laden with what seemed like centuries of untold stories. "She didn't speak much about her past, especially about what happened before I was born. I knew she had lived in Europe and had a different life, but the details, the reasons, they were always a mystery. She only told me that my father, you," she added with a deliberate pause, as if the very word left a bitter taste in her mouth, "weren't there because you chose not to be." Every word from Ava pierced Miles, filling him with a mixture of guilt and desolation. He understood that this was the only story she had ever known, a version in which he was a ghost, someone who had chosen to move on without looking back. But Miles knew that things hadn't been that way, and even though he was aware that any attempt to explain his side might seem selfish, he felt he had to try. "It wasn't an easy choice," he replied, his voice heavy with contained emotion. "When I left, I didn't know that Mariana, that your mother, was pregnant. If I had known, Ava, I swear I would never have left her. My departure was one of the hardest decisions I ever made, but I thought it was for the best at the time. I was searching for something, trying to build a life that, I thought, she wouldn't want to share with me." Ava looked at him in silence, her dark eyes shining with a mixture of resentment and curiosity. It was clear that his words didn't erase the pain and accumulated distrust, but he also noticed a slight spark of something else in her gaze, a hint of interest he hadn't seen before. "So, you think an explanation solves everything?" she asked, crossing her arms with a challenging expression. "You think you can just come here, tell me your version of events, and that everything will be fine?" Miles sighed, fully aware that she was right. There were no magic words that could erase the years of absence and the pain he had caused. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away without at least trying to bridge the gap between them. "I know an explanation isn't enough," he said, his tone filled with an unusual gravity. "I know I can't change what happened or make up for the years I wasn't there. But I want to know you, Ava. I want to know who you are, and I want you to have the chance to know who I am. Not because I think that will redeem me, but because I think we both deserve to know the truth." Ava pressed her lips together, as if holding back a surge of conflicting emotions. For her, her mother was a sacred figure, someone who had sacrificed everything to raise her alone, and accepting Miles's presence in her life meant questioning the certainties she had grown up with. However, behind the hardness of her expression, Miles could see the exhaustion of someone who had carried too heavy a burden on her shoulders for too long. Finally, after a long silence, Ava looked away and murmured, almost in a whisper, "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't even know if I want to try." Miles felt her words fall over him like a bucket of cold water, but he also understood that this was a natural reaction. He couldn't expect her to accept his explanation immediately, nor that simply knowing the truth would change her perception of him. "I don't expect you to," he said softly. "I just hope that, someday, you might understand that my absence wasn't due to a lack of love, but to ignorance. If I had known you existed, I would have looked for you. I assure you." Ava looked at him, and for a moment, her eyes softened, though the tension in her face did not entirely disappear. She seemed torn between the desire to believe his words and the resentment she had harbored for years. "All that sounds too convenient," she murmured, turning her gaze back to the horse, which now neighed softly, oblivious to the tension filling the stable. But I don't know. I guess things are never as simple as we'd like them to be. Miles felt a spark of hope hearing those words. He knew they didn't mean immediate acceptance, but he also understood that Ava was at least open to exploring the truth, to unraveling the secrets that had remained hidden for so many years. Not knowing what else to say, he remained silent, respecting the space she seemed to need. And as the sun continued its descent, casting shadows over the farm in the evening light, Miles realized that, despite the difficulties, he had taken a small step toward reconciliation. Perhaps it wouldn't be enough to earn her trust, but it was a beginning, and he was willing to wait, to work each day to earn a place in her life. The next day began with a sense of calm as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the cracks in the barn windows. Although Miles had spent a restless night filled with troubled thoughts, he woke up early, determined to help in whatever way he could. He didn't want to simply observe from a distance, he wanted to be part of Ava's daily life, even if it was only through the small tasks around the farm. When he stepped out into the yard, he found Ava near the stable, checking the condition of the fences and tools with a serious, focused expression. They exchanged a brief greeting, but it seemed they had reached a silent truce, a shared space in which they could coexist without confronting all the pain of the past at every moment. It was as if, for a brief moment, they could both set aside their unhealed wounds and lose themselves in the simplicity of daily work. However, that fragile peace was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected figure. Brad, a tall, robust man with a face hardened by years of field work and an inquisitive look, was walking toward them from the other side of the entry path. His boots crunched over the gravel with each step, and the distrust on his face was unmistakable. Miles noticed Ava's jaw tighten as she crossed her arms, as if bracing herself for a confrontation. Though he didn't fully understand the relationship between Ava and Brad, he sensed that this man had a deep connection with the farm, and, in a way, with the story of Mariana and her daughter. When Brad reached them, his gaze first settled on Miles, scanning him from head to toe, as though analyzing every single one of his movements. "So, you're the man who appeared out of nowhere," Brad said, not bothering to hide the disdain in his voice. His tone held a sharpness that made it clear he wasn't here to offer a warm welcome. Miles nodded, trying to remain calm and respectful, though Brad's tone and stance were openly hostile. "Yes, my name is Miles," he replied, extending his hand in a cordial gesture. However, Brad didn't even attempt to reciprocate. Instead, he crossed his arms, remaining firmly in place. Ava intervened then, her tone revealing a mix of irritation and resignation triggered by Brad's attitude. "Brad, he's here because of his car. He doesn't have any other reason to stay," she said, though there was a note of insecurity in her voice, as if she wasn't entirely convinced of what she was saying. The man didn't seem satisfied with her explanation, and his gaze remained fixed on Miles, who could feel the intensity of Brad's distrust with each passing second. Finally, Brad let out a scoff and turned to Ava. "Look, Ava," he began, his tone harsh but laden with genuine concern. "I don't know what story this man has told you, but I just want to make sure you're okay. I don't think it's wise for you to stay here alone with someone you barely know." Miles felt the sting of Brad's words. Though he understood that the man was only protecting Ava, he couldn't help but feel the sting of the implicit accusation. But beyond his pride, he was willing to remain calm and try to understand the reasons behind Brad's hostility. He knew that, in a way, his unexpected arrival might appear suspicious. "Brad, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine," Ava responded firmly, though her words held a note of discomfort. Her eyes briefly shifted toward Miles, as if trying to gauge the reaction of both men. Brad didn't seem convinced. He took a step toward Miles, drawing close enough that the tension became almost palpable. His eyes reflected a mix of controlled anger and something Miles interpreted as a deep loyalty toward Ava. "Listen carefully, stranger," Brad said in a low tone, though firm enough for his words to carry undeniable weight. "This farm has been through a lot, and Ava has had to endure more than you can imagine. If you're here with any intention other than to help her, I suggest you leave immediately. We don't need someone like you complicating her life." Miles took a deep breath, reminding himself that Brad was acting this way because he cared for Ava. Despite the displeasure that Brad's accusations provoked, he tried to keep his response steady. "I understand that you're worried, Brad," he said, his tone calm and sincere. "And you're right, this farm and Ava have been through a lot. But I'm here precisely because I want to help. I know I don't have the right to ask anything of Ava or to expect her to accept me immediately, but I want to stay and do whatever I can to support her." Brad looked at him, narrowing his eyes as if trying to decipher the truth behind his words. For a few seconds, the silence between them was so dense it seemed to envelop the entire yard, freezing even Ava, who watched them with a mixture of tension and curiosity. Finally, Brad looked away, letting out a sigh filled with resignation. "I suppose Ava knows what she's doing," he muttered, directing a slight nod toward her. However, before turning away, he threw one last warning at Miles. "But don't be mistaken, I'll be watching. I don't trust you, and I don't think my opinion will change anytime soon." With those words, Brad turned and left, leaving an echo of tension in the air. Miles watched him go, and when he turned back to Ava, he found her looking at him with an expression that was hard to read, as if she were trying to figure out who this man was who had so suddenly entered her life. "I'm sorry about Brad," she said finally, with a mix of apology and exasperation. "He's always been protective of me. Since my mother died, he's been keeping an eye on the farm and me. He doesn't trust strangers easily, and I suppose well, you're more than that, but also less." Miles nodded, understanding Brad's position and the difficulty Ava faced in explaining a situation she herself hadn't entirely accepted. "Don't worry. I understand. I just want him to know that my intentions are sincere, and that I'm not here to complicate things for you but to support you, if you'll allow me." Ava looked at him in silence for a moment, and then, as if deciding the conversation had reached its end, she simply nodded and returned to her tasks. Miles understood that, despite Brad's hostility and the barrier Ava still maintained, time and perseverance would be his greatest allies. He knew the road to reconciliation would be arduous, but he was willing to walk it, step by step, if it meant someday earning his daughter's respect and trust. As the evening fell after a long day of repairs and maintenance around the farm, Miles sat on the porch, watching the vast sky, which had begun to take on a soft orange hue. The peace of the sunset invited him to reflect, and his mind soon filled with memories he had tried to leave behind for so many years. Ava was a few meters away, organizing the tools they had used throughout the day. Her silent, strong, and independent presence reminded him so much of Mariana that he found it difficult to separate the past from the present. The silence between them persisted, but Miles couldn't help but wonder how much Ava truly knew about her mother's life. He wondered if, in some corner of her memory, she held memories of Mariana's youth in Europe, of the passion they had shared for art, and of the dreams they had before he chose to leave. After a long while, feeling the need to break the ice somehow, Miles looked at Ava, who continued to work with the same intensity as always. "Did she ever tell you about her days as an artist?" he asked softly, trying to make the question sound as unobtrusive as possible. Ava stopped what she was doing and slowly turned toward him, her gaze reflecting a mix of curiosity and caution. She seemed to be torn between the discomfort of opening up to a man she barely knew and the genuine desire to learn more about the unknown fragments of her mother's life. She didn't talk much about her past, she replied in a low, almost evasive tone. "I always felt like there was something she wanted to forget, or someone," she added, casting a fleeting glance at Miles that hinted at a hidden resentment. "She used to tell me that some things were better left in the past." Miles sighed, feeling the weight of those words settle in his soul. Mariana had always been a passionate woman, with a sparkle in her eyes that illuminated any place she entered. He remembered how she would laugh as she worked on her sculptures, talking about the plans they had together and the places they wanted to visit. Now, thinking that she had wanted to leave it all behind, including those happy memories, was devastating to him. "Your mother was an incredible person," he finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. "She was strong, creative, full of life. She had a unique way of seeing the world, of finding beauty in the simplest things. She was the one who taught me to appreciate art in a way I never imagined." Ava watched him in silence, her expression slightly softened, though her eyes still held a mixture of disbelief and skepticism. "Then why did you leave?" she asked suddenly, without any preamble, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to throw that question at him. Her tone was direct, almost challenging, making it clear that she wouldn't accept a superficial answer. Miles lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze for a moment, as he searched for the right words to answer the question he feared the most. He knew that nothing he could say would justify the pain he had caused, but he wanted her to understand his perspective, even if only a little. "When I left, it wasn't because I didn't love her," he murmured, trying to explain the whirlwind of emotions that had driven him to leave. "It was because I didn't think I could offer her the life she deserved. I felt there were so many things in the world that I hadn't yet discovered, and I was blinded by that search for something I couldn't even define." Ava listened in silence, her face impassive, though her eyes betrayed a mixture of emotions that fluctuated between understanding and resentment. It was evident that she was trying to process his words, unsure whether or not to believe him. "So you decided that your dreams were more important than she was?" she asked finally, with a tone that mixed disdain and pain. "You left my mother alone, in a place she didn't know, just because you wanted to see the world." The bluntness of her words hit Miles like a blow, making him feel a knot in his throat. He knew that was the perception Ava had of him her whole life, and it hurt deeply to think of the suffering Mariana must have experienced, alone and with no explanation. "It wasn't that simple, Ava," he said, his voice trembling. "I loved her, but, at that time, I was young and foolish. I thought I could come back, that there was time for everything, and that our story would continue. I never imagined that I was saying goodbye forever. I didn't even know you existed. If I had known, I would never have left your mother alone. I'm sorry. I deeply regret the pain I caused you both." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Ava looked away, her fingers playing with the tools in her hands as if she were trying to contain the surge of emotions threatening to overflow. Finally, she sighed and sat on the edge of the porch, looking out toward the horizon. "I always wondered why you weren't there," she said quietly, as if talking more to herself than to him. "When I was little, I sometimes thought you would appear, that you would come looking for me and tell me you had always thought of me. But I grew up and learned to stop waiting. I suppose it was my mother who taught me that we don't always get answers for everything." Miles felt the pain in her words resonate in his own heart, realizing how deep the wounds he had left were, even without being aware of their existence. He sat beside her on the porch, respecting her space but without averting his gaze from her profile. "I can't change the past, Ava. But I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me. I don't expect everything to be resolved overnight, or for you to forget what you've been through. I just want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust." Ava remained silent, watching as the sun began to disappear behind the hills, painting the sky a deep red. For an instant, she looked like a little girl lost in her thoughts, a girl who had once dreamed of meeting her father, only to find herself in front of a stranger who now sought redemption. "I don't know if I can ever trust you," she murmured at last, her voice filled with sadness and skepticism. "Not after all this time." Miles nodded, understanding the magnitude of her words. He knew that the path to reconciliation would be long and difficult, but he was willing to walk it. "Then give me time," he asked, his voice filled with sincerity. "All I ask is time, Ava. Just time to show you that I'm here to stay, and that I'm not going to leave again." The last light of day faded, plunging them into the twilight of night. Ava didn't respond, but neither did she stand up to leave. They remained in silence, sharing the stillness of the evening, while the night wind began to blow softly, like an echo from the past that still bound them. The next morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, Miles heard footsteps approaching the barn. He quickly got up, still feeling the fatigue of a night filled with restless thoughts. When he opened the door, he found Ava standing there, her expression hard and determined, as if she had been pondering something throughout the night. "I want to show you something," she said abruptly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Her eyes, though stern, reflected a restrained emotion, something Miles couldn't quite identify. He nodded, not asking any questions, and followed her as she led him toward a smaller building at the back of the farm. Miles hadn't noticed it before, the barn and the stables had taken all his attention until then. As they approached, he could see that this small building was in better condition than the rest of the farm, as if someone had taken special care to maintain it. When Ava opened the door, she allowed Miles to enter first. Inside, a mixture of wood and dampness filled the air. Light filtered through a narrow window, illuminating shelves full of carefully stored objects. But what immediately captured his attention was a particular corner, a table, covered in dust, on which various sculpting tools rested. As he moved closer, Miles instantly recognized Mariana's touch in each of those pieces. He felt as if time had stopped, transporting him back to the small studio in Paris where he and Mariana had spent so many hours creating and sharing moments of complicity. "This was her studio," Ava said, breaking the silence with a voice that was barely a whisper. "My mother, she never stopped sculpting. Even after she moved here and decided I was her priority, she always found time to work on her sculptures. She always told me she needed this space to be herself." Miles swallowed, feeling each of Ava's words unearth buried memories. He stepped closer to the table and ran his fingers over the dust-covered tools. He remembered perfectly how Mariana used to hold that metal spatula, how she moved it with precision to bring her imagined figures to life. It was as if, in some way, her presence still lingered in that space. "I had no idea she continued with her art," he murmured, unable to hide the emotion in his voice. I thought she had left everything behind, that she had started a completely new life here." Ava nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the objects that had once belonged to her mother. "That's what everyone thought," she replied, her tone filled with sadness. "But she never stopped being who she was. I think, deep down, she was still clinging to the part of herself she couldn't bring here. She never told me why she moved to this place, so far from everything, she only told me it was what she had to do. Now I'm starting to understand that you were part of the story she never told me." Miles felt a pang in his chest. Knowing that Mariana had continued with her art, that she had carefully preserved that corner of her life, gave him a strange sense of comfort and sadness at the same time. He realized how much that separation must have cost her, and he felt a wave of remorse and nostalgia wash over him. "Ava," he said, his voice soft and breaking, "I can't tell you how sorry I am for not being here for you both. I didn't know. I didn't know everything she meant to me. I'm truly sorry." Ava looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something resembling acknowledgement. Though it wasn't a look of forgiveness, it did seem to carry a glimmer of understanding. Perhaps, for the first time, she was beginning to see the story from a different perspective, even if only a little. "It's not easy for me, Miles," she confessed. "I've always seen this place as our refuge, the only place in the world that was just my mother's and mine. But now, I realize it also belonged to someone else. And that hurts." Miles nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He knew that his presence on the farm was stirring up emotions Ava had kept hidden for years, and although it meant he was making progress in reconnecting, he also understood that he was causing her pain in the process. "I don't want to take anything from you, Ava," he said sincerely. "This place is yours, and it always will be. I just want you to know that I'm here to help, to support you, and that if you ever want to talk about her, about who she was before, I'll be here." Ava didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the corner of the studio, where Mariana's tools and sketches still held the echo of her creativity. After a long moment, she nodded slightly, without looking at him, as if she were accepting his offer without fully committing. Finally, Miles turned to leave, letting Ava remain alone in the studio. He knew that this space was sacred to her, and that his presence there was only tolerated because of the intensity of the emotions they were both sharing. Just before stepping out, he paused at the threshold, looking back at his daughter one more time, observing her silhouette as she quietly took in the artistic legacy of her mother. In that moment, he realized that although the path to redemption would be long and painful, he had taken significant steps forward. Ava had shared an intimate corner of her life with him, a place that contained the essence of Mariana, and even though a vast emotional chasm still lay between them, this moment of honesty gave them a foundation to build upon. As he walked away from the studio and the sun continued to rise in the sky, Miles felt a faint sense of peace. It wasn't complete peace, but it was a promise that, perhaps, one day, he might come to understand the impact of his absence and, maybe, find a way to redeem himself. That night, Ava decided to prepare dinner in the house, and although she didn't ask Miles to join her, he offered to help. There was something in the routine of cooking, in the simple act of chopping vegetables and preparing ingredients, that gave him a sense of normalcy and closeness that had, until now, been elusive between them. However, the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension, as though the weight of everything unsaid hung in the air, ready to fall at any moment. While they prepared the meal in silence, Miles watched Ava out of the corner of his eye. Every movement of hers was precise, almost mechanical, but it also showed a certain emotional exhaustion. He couldn't imagine how many nights she might have spent like this, taking care of the farm, cooking alone, without the company of a loved one with whom to share her thoughts and concerns. Finally, when they sat down at the table, the silence became almost unbearable. The sounds of cutlery on plates and the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth were the only things filling the room. Miles looked around, noting the simple details of the decor, the objects Mariana and Ava had chosen to give the place personality. It was a house full of memories, of moments lived in his absence. After several minutes, Miles decided to break the silence. "This place is welcoming. It feels like a real home," he commented softly, almost timidly. "I can see that a lot of love has been lived here." Ava, who was focused on her plate, looked up and regarded him with an enigmatic expression, as if trying to decide whether or not to respond. "My mother and I were always fine here," she finally replied, her voice cold but controlled. "We didn't have an easy life, but she always found a way to make things feel enough." Miles nodded, sensing the pride and strength in her words. He understood that for Ava, the farm and the life she had shared with her mother were a sanctuary, a place that represented everything he had not been for them. "Your mother was always like that. She had a strength that inspired me, even though I wasn't always wise enough to appreciate it," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly as memories of Mariana flooded his mind. "I spent so many years not realizing what I had in front of me." Ava looked at him steadily, and for an instant, he saw a hint of sadness in her eyes. But soon, that expression vanished, replaced by the same caution and distrust as always. "She never mentioned you." Ava's statement was as direct as it was painful, and her words seemed to carry an implicit judgment that Miles couldn't help but feel. He nodded, accepting that harsh reality. He knew that Mariana had kept silent about him, and although it hurt, he understood that it was the way she had chosen to protect her daughter. "I can imagine. It couldn't have been easy for her to remember what we shared. I left her when she needed me most, and there's no excuse for that," Miles said, lowering his gaze to his plate, unable to face the weight of his own words. Ava remained silent, her gaze fixed on him as if evaluating every one of his words. Finally, she sighed and, in a softer tone, commented, "I always felt like something was missing. Even though she never told me, I knew there were parts of her life she had left behind. Now I realize that you were one of those parts." Miles felt a lump in his throat. The vulnerability in Ava's words revealed a side of her he hadn't seen until now. It was as if, despite all the pain and anger, there was also a part of her that sought to understand, that wanted to make sense of what her mother had kept hidden. "Ava," he said in a low, sorrowful tone, "it pains me to think of everything she must have gone through alone. I can't change what I did, but I want to be part of your life, somehow, if you'll allow me." She didn't respond immediately. Her dark eyes reflected an internal struggle, a conflict that seemed to have grown over the years and that now intensified with each word Miles spoke. After a long moment, she sighed and rose from the table, setting her plate aside. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to see you as anything more than a stranger," she admitted, her voice carrying the mix of pain and resentment she had been carrying within her. "But, maybe I can learn to accept that you're part of my past, even if you weren't part of my life." Miles nodded, understanding that this was the closest he could get to acceptance at that moment. He knew that Ava's wounds would not heal easily, and that his own mistakes had left deep scars on the relationship they were only beginning to build. The dinner ended in silence, and though the words they exchanged were few, they meant a great deal to Miles. He had managed to glimpse a little of the sadness and longing in Ava's eyes, and although a long road lay ahead, that night he felt he had taken a step toward reconciliation. The next morning, as Miles left the barn after another restless night, he found Brad waiting in the yard. The man stood with his arms crossed and his brow furrowed, as if he had been there for hours, waiting for Miles to appear. His expression held a mix of defiance and warning that Miles immediately sensed, and he knew this encounter would not be easy. Brad took a few steps toward him, scrutinizing him with a critical, distrustful look. "I thought you'd have decided to leave by now," Brad said curtly, making no attempt to hide his distaste. "I don't understand what you're doing here, hanging around the farm like you're part of the family. She doesn't need someone like you." Miles took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure in the face of Brad's hostility. He understood that the man was there to protect Ava, that he had been her support over the years. Still, Miles felt compelled to defend his presence and his decision to stay. "I know you have no reason to trust me, Brad," he responded calmly. "But I'm here because I want to help, because I believe it's the right thing to do. I'm not trying to take anything from Ava or from you. I just want to be part of her life, if she'll let me." Brad let out a sarcastic laugh and shook his head, as if the very idea seemed absurd to him. "Help?" he repeated mockingly. "You show up here, after decades, not knowing anything about what she and her mother went through, and now you're here with pretty words. But the reality is you weren't there when they needed you most, and that's something Ava won't forget, nor will I." Miles felt a pang of guilt hearing those words, but he knew he couldn't let Brad's anger deter him from his purpose. He knew it was true that he had arrived late, but he also believed that, at the very least, he deserved a chance to try to amend his mistake. "You're right," he admitted, looking at Brad sincerely. "I wasn't there when Mariana needed me, nor when Ava was growing up. Nothing I say will change that. But I'm here now, because I want to be the support I wasn't back then. I don't expect you to understand or to accept me, but I'm not going to leave just because you tell me to." Brad clenched his fists, his expression hardening, and he took another step closer to Miles, until they were standing face to face. "Listen to me, stranger. Ava doesn't need you to come save her. She's strong, stronger than you can imagine, because she's had to be. She's faced more than you know, and the last thing she needs is for someone like you to come and complicate her life." Miles held Brad's gaze, recognizing the fierce sense of protection in his words. He knew that Brad was more than just a friend to Ava, he was someone who had been her family, her guide, someone who had been there when Miles was not. And instead of seeing him as an enemy, Miles decided to approach him from a different angle. "I understand, Brad," he said, keeping his calm. "I know you've been there for her, that you've been the support I wasn't. And I'm grateful for that. I'm not trying to replace you or take your place. I just want to be someone she can trust too." Brad remained silent, his gaze still filled with skepticism, but something in his expression softened slightly, as if Miles's sincerity had found a crack in his armor. "I don't know if Ava will ever be able to trust you," Brad finally replied, his tone less aggressive. But if you ever hurt her, if you cause her more pain than she's already endured, then you'll know what it means to face me. Miles nodded, understanding the seriousness of Brad's warning and accepting it as part of the price he had to pay for his past absence. He knew that Brad wouldn't be easy to win over, but he also understood that the man spoke from a place of love and loyalty toward Ava. I understand, Brad. And I promise you, I'm not here to hurt her. I just want to do whatever I can to help her move forward. Brad stared at him for a few more moments, as if trying to decide whether he could really trust him, and then he stepped back with a sigh of resignation. We'll see, he muttered quietly before turning and walking away. Miles watched Brad's retreating figure, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. He knew that Brad would keep an eye on him, that any misstep would be judged harshly, and that he would have to prove, day by day, that his intentions were sincere. For the first time, however, he felt he had made a small breakthrough, that the wall of distrust between him and Brad had slightly cracked. And although earning Brad's acceptance was not his ultimate goal, he knew that having his respect would be an important step on the path to reconciliation with Ava. With renewed resolve, Miles returned to work, ready to earn his place on the farm, not just to show Ava his commitment but also to honor the memory of Mariana, the woman he had loved and lost. He knew the road ahead was long, but that confrontation had given him new motivation, another reason to stay and fight for the bond he hoped to build. That evening, after a long day working on the farm, Miles decided to take advantage of the coolness of the evening and stepped onto the porch, where he could watch the sky turn shades of red and orange. That little corner offered him a place for reflection, a space where he could organize his thoughts and process everything he had experienced since his arrival. As he became lost in the view of the distant hills, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Ava, who approached in silence and, without saying a word, sat down next to him. Miles noticed a strange melancholy in her expression, as if she were carrying an invisible weight that, until now, she had chosen to bear alone. They both sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun disappear behind the hills, letting the sound of the wind fill the space between them. Finally, Ava spoke, her voice soft and hesitant, a tone Miles hadn't heard from her before. There's something I've never told anyone, she confessed, without looking at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I always thought I could handle it alone, that I didn't need to share it with anyone, but, since you've been here, I feel as if part of me wants you to know. Miles felt his heart race at her words. He knew that whatever she was about to say would be important, and he both feared and desired to hear it. Her voice, tinged with vulnerability, was a rare occurrence for Ava, and Miles knew he had to be patient and give her the time she needed to open up. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, Ava, he said gently, wanting to give her the freedom to decide. But if you need to talk, I'm here to listen. Ava nodded slowly, and after a few seconds, she began to speak, her voice barely a murmur in the quiet night. When I was little, my mother would tell me stories about a man who, she paused, as if the words were difficult to say, a man who left to search for something more. She never said it was you, never mentioned your name, but deep down, I always knew there was a reason he wasn't there. At first, I idealized him, like all kids do. I thought one day he'd come back, that he'd come find me, but as I grew up, I realized that wasn't going to happen. Miles felt a painful twinge in his chest, imagining that little Ava, waiting and dreaming of the arrival of a father she didn't even know existed. He understood now how much that absence had meant to her, and he felt the weight of his guilt grow with every word she spoke. Ava, I'm so sorry, he murmured, his voice laden with regret. I never imagined that my absence could cause so much pain. If I had known, if I had understood what I was leaving behind, I would never have left. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on the darkening landscape. After a moment, she turned to him, and in her face, Miles saw a mixture of sadness and resignation. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, she said, her voice tinged with a strange calm. I'm saying it because, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I need to let it go, like I need to understand that some things can't be changed, no matter how much we want them to. Miles nodded, understanding that her words were both a revelation and a form of acceptance. Ava was allowing herself to release the weight of a past that had tormented her for years, and he knew that this was a step toward a possible reconciliation, even if it was only within herself. After a long silence, Miles found the courage to speak, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ava, I know I can't ask you to forgive me. But I want you to know that every day I spend here, I understand more and more how much I failed you. I can't change the past, but I'm here for you now, and I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I care." Ava looked at him for a few moments, her expression softening slightly, though her eyes still held a shadow of distrust. In the end, she nodded, as if accepting his words without fully committing. "I guess time will tell if you're really here to stay," she finally said, her tone distant but carrying a faint trace of hope. "For now, that's all I can give you." Miles accepted her response, understanding that the road to redemption would be long and would require time and patience. But in that moment, as they shared the peace of the night, he felt he had made a little more progress, that although Ava's wounds were still there, he had managed to find a small place in her life. They both sat in silence, watching as the moon rose in the sky and the stars began to appear. Although there were many things left to resolve, that night they shared a stillness that, for the first time, was not marked by resentment but by a faint hope that promised something better. The next morning, Miles awoke before dawn, feeling a strange sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He left the barn and walked into the fields, where the fog was beginning to lift under the soft light of dawn. The sky was still dark, but the horizon already showed a faint pink glow, heralding the new day. It was as if everything around him shared the promise of a new beginning, an opportunity to leave behind the pain of the past and build something different. As he gazed at the landscape, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Ava approaching. She, too, seemed to have risen early, and although her eyes showed the traces of a night filled with thoughts and memories, her expression was softer than ever, as if she had made peace with something within herself. "I never thought I'd say this," Ava said softly, stopping beside him and looking out at the horizon, "but I think I'm glad you're here. I may not know if I can forgive you, but now I understand more, and I think I needed that to be able to move on." Miles felt a lump in his throat, and for a moment, he was speechless, surprised by the sincerity of her words. That acceptance, though tentative and filled with reservations, was more than he had hoped for. It took him a few seconds to respond, but when he did, his voice was soft and filled with emotion. "Ava, I can't tell you how much it means to me that you feel that way. I've spent so many years regretting the choices I made, and although I know nothing can change the past, having the opportunity to be here and be part of your life, even at this moment, is something I never thought I'd have." Ava nodded, and for an instant, a faint smile crossed her face. She seemed calmer, as if the weight of her memories had begun to fade. They both remained in silence, watching as the light of the sun began to bathe the fields, illuminating the hills and the landscape that meant so much to her. In that stillness, it was as if time had stopped, allowing them to share a moment of mutual understanding. "There's something else I want to say to you," Miles continued, turning slightly toward her. "I know words aren't enough, but I want you to know that, whatever happens, I'm here to stay. Not just for you, but because I want to honor the memory of your mother. Mariana was someone who marked my life in ways I didn't know how to value at the time, and now I want to make sure that everything she built isn't lost." Ava looked at him closely, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen before, an acceptance that, although fragile, showed she was willing to give him a chance. "My mother was strong," she said quietly, with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "She taught me to fight, to face each day as if it were the most important. I know that, in some way, she loved you, even if she never told me. And now, I'd like to think she'd be happy to know you're here." They shared a shy smile, and the tension that had existed between them for so long began to dissolve in the quiet of the morning. Miles felt that he had finally crossed an invisible barrier, that there was now a possibility of building something real with Ava, even if it was only from that fragile understanding. The sun had fully risen in the sky, bathing the farm in warm, golden light. Ava turned toward the house, and after a moment of hesitation, she gestured for Miles to follow her. He did, and together they walked toward the house, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the present, into a life that, although uncertain, now belonged to both of them. That new day, marked by the promise of a future, offered them a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to start anew. The following morning, just as Miles was stepping out of the barn after another restless night, he found Brad standing in the yard. The man stood firm, arms crossed, and his expression held a mixture of challenge and warning that Miles instantly understood. He knew this would not be an easy conversation. Brad took a few steps toward him, studying him with a sharp, distrustful look. "I thought you'd have decided to leave by now," Brad said, his tone curt and unmistakably hostile. "I don't understand what you're still doing here, lurking around the farm like you belong here. She doesn't need someone like you." Miles took a deep breath, reminding himself to keep his composure in the face of Brad's hostility. He understood that the man's protective instincts were aimed at Ava, that he had been her rock for years. Still, he felt compelled to stand his ground and defend his decision to stay. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me, Brad," he responded in a calm tone. "But I'm here because I want to help, because I believe it's the right thing to do. I'm not here to take anything away from Ava or from you. I just want to be part of her life, if she'll let me." Brad let out a cynical laugh and shook his head, as if the very idea was absurd to him. "Help?" he repeated with a mocking tone. "You show up here, after decades, knowing nothing about what she and her mother went through, and now you're here with your pretty words. But the reality is, you weren't there when they needed you most, and that's something Ava won't forget, nor will I." Miles felt a pang of guilt as he listened to Brad's words, but he knew he couldn't let the man's anger deter him from his purpose. He knew he had arrived too late and that no words could change that, but he also believed he at least deserved a chance to try and amend his mistakes. "You're right," he admitted, looking at Brad sincerely. "I wasn't there when Mariana needed me, nor when Ava was growing up. Nothing I say will change that. But I'm here now because I want to be the support I couldn't be back then. I don't expect you to understand or accept me, but I'm not going to leave just because you tell me to." Brad clenched his fists, his expression hardening as he stepped even closer to Miles, standing inches away. "Listen closely, stranger. Ava doesn't need you to come here and save her. She's strong, stronger than you could ever imagine, because she's had to be. She's faced more than you know, and the last thing she needs is for someone like you to come and complicate her life." Miles held Brad's gaze, sensing the intensity of his words and the depth of his protective instincts. He knew that Brad was more than just a friend to Ava, he was someone who had been her family, her guide, the one who had stood by her when Miles hadn't. Instead of seeing him as an adversary, Miles decided to approach him from a different angle. "I understand, Brad," he said, maintaining a calm tone. "I know you've been there for her, that you've been the support I wasn't. And I'm grateful for that. I'm not trying to replace you or take your place. I just want to be someone she can trust too." Brad fell silent, his gaze still skeptical, but something in his expression softened slightly, as if he could sense the sincerity in Miles's words. "I don't know if Ava will ever be able to trust you," Brad finally replied, his voice slightly less aggressive. "But if you ever hurt her, if you cause her more pain than she's already endured, you'll find out what it's like to face me." Miles nodded, fully understanding the seriousness of Brad's warning and accepting it as part of the price he had to pay for his absence. He knew that Brad wouldn't be easy to win over, but he also understood that the man spoke from a place of love and loyalty toward Ava. "I understand, Brad. And I promise, I'm not here to hurt her. I just want to do whatever I can to help her move forward." Brad looked at him for a few more moments, as if trying to gauge his sincerity, and finally stepped back with a sigh of resignation. "We'll see," he muttered under his breath before turning and walking away. Miles watched Brad leave, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. He knew that Brad would keep a close eye on him, that any misstep would be harshly judged, and that he would have to prove, day by day, that his intentions were genuine. For the first time, however, he felt he had made a small breakthrough, that the wall of distrust between him and Brad had slightly cracked. And although Brad's acceptance wasn't his ultimate goal, Miles knew that earning his respect would be an important step in his path to reconciling with Ava. With renewed determination, Miles returned to his work on the farm, committed to earning his place there, not just to demonstrate his dedication to Ava, but also to honor the memory of Mariana, the woman he had loved and lost. He knew the road ahead was long, but that confrontation had given him a new sense of purpose, another reason to stay and fight for the connection he hoped to build. That night, after a long day's work, Miles decided to enjoy the cool evening air and stepped out onto the porch. The view of the hills bathed in soft reds and oranges provided him a quiet space for reflection, where he could process everything that had happened since his arrival. As he gazed at the distant landscape, lost in thought, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Ava. She walked up quietly and, without a word, sat down beside him. Miles noticed a faint melancholy in her expression, as though she were carrying an invisible weight she had chosen to bear alone until now. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun disappear behind the hills, letting the wind's soft whispers fill the space between them. Finally, Ava spoke, her voice gentle and hesitant, a tone Miles hadn't heard before. "There's something I've never told anyone," she began, her gaze fixed on the horizon, not meeting his eyes. "I always thought I could handle it on my own, that I didn't need to share it with anyone, but, since you've been here, it feels like part of me wants you to know." Miles felt his heart race at her words. He knew that whatever she was about to reveal would be significant, and he both feared and longed to hear it. Her voice, softened by vulnerability, was rare for Ava, and he knew he needed to be patient, to give her the time she needed to open up. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, Ava," he said softly, offering her the freedom to choose. "But if you feel like talking, I'm here to listen." Ava nodded slowly, and after a few moments of silence, she began to speak, her voice barely a whisper against the night's quiet. "When I was little, my mother told me stories about a man who," she paused, as if the words were hard to speak, "a man who left to look for something more. She never said it was you, never mentioned your name, but deep down, I always knew there was a reason he wasn't there. At first, I idealized him, the way kids do. I thought he'd come back someday, that he'd come looking for me, but as I grew up, I realized that wasn't going to happen." Miles felt a painful tightness in his chest as he imagined a young Ava, waiting and dreaming of a father she didn't know existed. He understood now just how much his absence had meant to her, and he felt his guilt deepen with every word she shared. "Ava, I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "I never imagined that my absence could cause so much pain. If I had known, if I had understood what I was leaving behind, I would never have left." She remained silent, her eyes fixed on the landscape growing darker with the setting sun. After a moment, she turned to him, and in her face, Miles saw a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," she said, her voice strangely calm. "I'm saying it because, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I need to let it go, to understand that some things can't be changed, no matter how much we want them to." Miles nodded, recognizing her words as both a revelation and a form of acceptance. Ava was finally allowing herself to release the weight of a past that had tormented her for years, and he knew this was a step toward a possible reconciliation, even if it was only within herself. After a long silence, Miles found the courage to speak, his voice filled with emotion. "Ava, I know I can't ask you to forgive me. But I want you to know that every day I spend here, I understand more and more how much I failed you. I can't change the past, but I'm here for you now, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I care." Ava looked at him, her expression softening slightly, though her eyes still held a shadow of doubt. After a moment, she nodded, as if accepting his words without fully committing. I guess time will tell if you're really here to stay, she finally said, her tone distant but carrying a faint glimmer of hope. For now, that's all I can give you. Miles accepted her response, understanding that his journey toward redemption would be long and would require patience. But in that moment, as they shared the peace of the night, he felt he had taken another step forward, that despite Ava's lingering wounds, he had managed to find a small place in her life. They sat in silence, watching as the moon rose in the sky and stars began to appear. Though there was still much to resolve, that night they shared a tranquility that, for the first time, wasn't tainted by resentment but by a faint hope that promised something better. What hurt the most, Ava continued, her voice trembling slightly, was seeing how hard my mother worked to be strong, to make sure I didn't see the emptiness you left behind. She never blamed me for anything, never made me feel like I was the reason for her pain. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I could see her in silence, her eyes distant, and I knew she was thinking about you. Miles closed his eyes, struggling to hold back the surge of emotions swirling inside him. The pain and guilt wrapped around him like a thick fog, and in that moment, he wished he could go back in time to correct every decision, every moment he had missed by not being there for them. Ava, I'm so sorry, he murmured, his voice heavy with remorse. I never realized that my absence could cause so much pain. If I had known, if I'd understood what I was leaving behind, I would never have gone. She stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the darkening landscape. After a moment, she turned back to him, and he saw a mixture of sadness and resignation on her face. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, she said, her voice carrying a strange calmness. I'm saying it because, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I need to let it go, to understand that some things can't be changed, no matter how much we wish they could. Miles nodded, understanding that her words were both a revelation and a form of acceptance. Ava was finally allowing herself to release the weight of a past that had haunted her for years, and he knew this was a step toward a possible reconciliation, even if it was just within herself. After a long silence, Miles found the courage to speak, his voice filled with emotion. Ava, I know I can't ask you to forgive me. But I want you to know that every day I spend here, I understand more and more how much I failed you. I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I care. Ava looked at him, her expression softening slightly, though her eyes still held a shadow of distrust. After a moment, she nodded, as if accepting his words without fully committing. I guess time will tell if you're really here to stay, she finally said, her tone distant but carrying a faint glimmer of hope. For now, that's all I can give you. Miles accepted her response, knowing that his path toward redemption would be long and would require patience. But in that moment, as they shared the peace of the night, he felt he had taken another step forward. Despite Ava's lingering wounds, he had managed to carve out a small place in her life. They both sat in silence, watching as the moon rose in the sky and stars began to appear. Although much remained to be resolved, that night they shared a quietness that, for the first time, wasn't marked by resentment but by a faint hope that promised something better. The next morning, Miles woke up before dawn, a sense of unease mixed with a strange feeling of peace lingering from the night before. He left the barn and walked into the fields, where the mist was slowly lifting under the first light of dawn. The sky was still dark, but a faint pink glow on the horizon signaled the start of a new day. It felt as if everything around him shared in the promise of a beginning, an opportunity to leave behind the pain of the past and build something different. As he gazed at the landscape, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Ava approaching. She, too, seemed to have risen early, and although her eyes bore the traces of a night filled with memories and thoughts, her expression was softer than he had ever seen, as though she had made peace with something within herself. I never thought I'd say this, Ava said quietly, stopping beside him and looking out at the horizon, but I think I'm glad you're here. Maybe I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but now I understand more, and I think I needed that to be able to move forward. Miles felt a lump in his throat, and for a moment, he was speechless, surprised by the sincerity of her words. That acceptance, though tentative and filled with reservations, was more than he had hoped for. It took him a few seconds to respond, but when he did, his voice was soft and filled with emotion. "Ava. I can't tell you how much it means to me that you feel that way. I've spent so many years regretting the choices I made, and although I know nothing can change the past, having the chance to be here, to be part of your life now, is something I never thought I'd have." Ava nodded, and for an instant, a faint smile crossed her face. She seemed more at ease, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to fade. They both remained in silence, watching as the light of the sun started to spill over the fields, illuminating the hills and the landscape that meant so much to her. In that quiet, it was as if time had paused, allowing them to share a moment of mutual understanding. "There's something else I want to say to you," Miles continued, turning slightly toward her. "I know words aren't enough, but I want you to know that, whatever happens, I'm here to stay. Not just for you, but because I want to honor the memory of your mother. Mariana was someone who marked my life in ways I didn't appreciate back then, and now I want to make sure that everything she built isn't lost." Ava looked at him carefully, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen before, an acceptance that, although fragile, showed she was willing to give him a chance. "My mother was strong," she said softly, with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "She taught me to fight, to face each day as if it were the most important. I know that, in some way, she loved you, even if she never told me. And now, I'd like to think she'd be happy to know you're here." They shared a shy smile, and the tension that had existed between them for so long seemed to dissolve in the calm of the morning. Miles felt that he had finally crossed an invisible barrier, that there was now a possibility of building something real with Ava, even if it was only from that fragile understanding. The sun had fully risen, bathing the farm in warm, golden light. Ava turned toward the house, and after a moment of hesitation, she gestured for Miles to follow her. He did, and together they walked toward the house, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the present, into a life that, although uncertain, now belonged to both of them. That new day, marked by the promise of a future, offered them a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to start anew. Over the next few weeks, Miles and Ava settled into a quiet rhythm on the farm. Each day brought new tasks, each small effort chipping away at the distance between them. Miles worked side by side with her, learning the ways of the farm, helping with the animals, mending fences, and even helping repair the family home where he and Mariana's memory lingered in every corner. He did his best to honor her legacy by becoming a reliable presence in Ava's life, ready to support her however he could. Despite the calm that seemed to settle over the days, Miles knew that there were still wounds left unhealed, questions left unanswered. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a shared ritual that had become a quiet bond, Ava finally broke the silence. "There's one thing I've been wanting to ask," she said, her gaze steady but cautious. "If you could go back, would you still have left?" The question lingered in the air, and Miles felt the weight of it settle over him. He took a long breath, gathering his thoughts, and finally answered with quiet honesty. "No, Ava," he replied, his voice soft but certain. "If I knew then what I know now, I would have stayed. I would have found a way to make things work, no matter the cost. But the choices I made, they were all I could see at the time. And though I can't change them, I can only hope to be here now, to be part of your life in whatever way you'll let me." Ava looked at him, her expression conflicted but softened. There was a long silence, then she gave a small nod, as if she had finally come to accept the truth of his words. "I think I can understand that," she said at last, her voice quiet and reflective. "My mother taught me that life is about moving forward, even when it hurts. And though it took me a long time to let go of the past, I think I'm finally ready." Miles felt a surge of relief and gratitude. He could see in her eyes that Ava was letting go of the resentment that had weighed on her heart for so long. Though forgiveness was a gradual process, they had reached a place where it could begin to take root. In the days that followed, the bond between them grew stronger, grounded in their shared love for the woman who had meant so much to both of them. They laughed more easily, shared more stories of Mariana, and even began to make plans for the farm's future together. Miles felt a deep sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years, a feeling that he had finally found his way back to something he had lost. One evening, as they sat together on the porch in comfortable silence, Ava turned to him, her gaze calm and steady. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for coming back. I think she would have wanted this." Miles reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze, his heart full of the peace he had been searching for all his life. "I think she would have wanted it too," he whispered, looking up at the stars that had started to twinkle in the night sky, feeling as though Mariana was somehow watching over them, proud of the path they had chosen. In that quiet night, Miles and Ava understood that they had built something real, something lasting, an unspoken promise to honor the past while embracing the future. As they sat side by side, the farm bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, they felt a sense of peace, a promise of healing, and the beginning of a new chapter, together.